Hello and welcome to Prophetic Voices, Preaching and Teaching Beloved Community, a podcast from the Episcopal Church's Office of Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care, where we explore the season and the lectionary through the lens of social justice. I'm your host, Reverend Shaneequa, Staff Officer for Racial Reconciliation, and I'm so glad you could join us. In this episode of Prophetic Voices, we'll be discussing the Good Friday lectionary. Our lovely guests this week are the Reverend Will Bouvel, who is the Associate Rector at Church of the Holy Comforter in Kenilworth, Illinois, and the co-founder of Tell Me the Truth About Racism, a storytelling approach to wondering, grieving, healing, and hearing good news in our racialized world. He comes to ministry after a degree in geography and careers as a computer programmer and a classical tenor soloist. The Reverend Luz Montes, who serves as the canon for welcome and discipleship at Christ Church Cathedral in Houston, Texas. Luz enjoys spending time with her spouse, sassy daughter, and dog. She is passionate about sharing God's love and making our world a more just place to live. And last but not least, the Reverend Dr. Hillary Raining, who is the rector of St. Christopher's Church in Gladwin, Pennsylvania, and creator of The Hive, online spirituality and wellness digital community. Additionally, Hillary is the beekeeper, yoga and meditation instructor, as well as a forest therapist. Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for being willing to be guests on the podcast. I'm very grateful to you all, and I know our listeners are too. What do you think is important to keep in mind this year for Holy Week, or specifically Good Friday?
One of the questions I always like to ask when we get to Good Friday, that at least has happened at the churches that I've been at, is this a time to preach, or do we let the service preach for us? I don't think I have a lot more to say than that, but I wanted to put that out to the other folks here to see what they think. I think it's a very contextual question, but as this is a resource, I know, for preachers who are wondering about what to preach, it feels like a really good first question to just wonder, especially on this day, should you preach? Or how should you show up as a preacher today? I wondered if maybe that was a way that our other folks would have some thoughts.
It's an interesting question in particular, since you're right, your setting has a lot to do with this. So how you draw in the liturgy would probably make a big difference in that. So some churches, only take communion from the reserved sacrament, or they don't do it at all. And I would imagine if you're going for the more Spartan and sparse approach, a sermon might actually feel like too much. Other folks, I think my church is an example of this. We tend to lean into Good Friday since many people haven't kept some of the other parts of Holy Week or even Lent in general. And Good Friday becomes a place where they're feeling the depth of the moment. And we kind of need to sit with it a little bit longer. The sermon slows us down in that case. At least that's something I tried to do as a preacher, to stop and consider at least one small part of the story that maybe we haven't thought of before. So that's my take here. But you're right; it's an interesting question, and each place's liturgical custom would probably have a lot to do with that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, Hillary. It's like your own cultural context really has a lot to do with how you kind of frame that around your own preaching and your own spirituality, right? Just thinking about how, some of the folks that I've served with, or even my sending parish growing up, Good Friday was one of the most attended services. So it was very important to incorporate some of that into the message, into how how the sermon or how you were going to preach on the text, because some people were not able to come to any of the other services. So,
do you have any liturgical suggestions for Good Friday?
I have some suggestions as well as some cautions. So I'll do a little of both. Suggestion-wise, I really do think you're centered around the sacrificial nature of this moment. And so in your setting, if you're going to do communion or not, I think really does become kind of the pivotal sacramental question, even maybe more so than the sermon. And if you're the sort of place for where normally you have smells and bells and so many hymns all the time, a counterbalance where you don't have communion and maybe you don't have hymns or you don't have a sermon can be really powerful to feel that stripping away. Or as we just said, if you have a place that this is a really important service, you might need to add a little bit more. You actually might need an extra hymn. You might need extra time and contemplation. That's maybe my second suggestion, building in contemplation. The liturgy itself has so many varieties of meditations and adorations that we can add into it. Try to add one this year, perhaps, and let people sit with the cross a little bit longer. That being said, here's my caution. I have been in many churches that try to, instead of leaning in to the somatic nature of it, they go a little bit too far, and I think can sometimes be emotionally manipulative. And it often shows up in some liturgical ways. I'll give you an example. I was once at a church where on Good Friday, a wooden cross was brought out, perfectly prayer book, nothing wrong with that. But then what they wanted everybody to do was to hammer in a nail as loudly as you could and think of it as your sins that you're hammering into Jesus. And it was a little over the top, I'm going to say. And he had also just given us the example in his sermon of a very graphic description of what a crucifixion entails, like a medical example. The whole thing was too much, right? Like it was emotional manipulation at that point. So I think it's finding that right balance that's so important to invite us into the story without abusing us into the story, as it were.
That really connects into my question about whether we preach or not, because it serves to open up that idea of what is this moment. In the course of these days, of these multiple services through Holy Week, we find ourselves here in this moment that has already begun and is not over. And to know how we show up in that, we are blessed in the Episcopal Church with a liturgy that we can lean on. And a lot of times we're we need to like open up things for people and help them connect and help them step away or bring their world that they live in into the church so that those things get connected. This is a day where that liturgy is presented to us really beautifully, that holds it in a different way that we might not need to add or embellish. We can kind of let it do the work because it is beautifully crafted and a great tradition. I think that it's important, if you're gonna be creative or get, to first understand what's going on in the service and how do you want to connect to it, and be really technical about how am I bringing about the gifts that are already present in this liturgy.
I think there's also something to say of just the different communities that we serve and how the services for Good Friday kind of develop. I grew up in a church where you had the Via Crucis, the station. It was all acted. There was room for that, and I think as I was hearing Hillary also point out to the nailing on the cross, there was for a minute I was like, oh my gosh, we did that, and then that is not what we did. There was an invitation for reflection that really was very intentional, and so I could see how we could really misinterpret some of the things that we do, but then when you think and really kind of get into the context or your own context, you realize, oh, okay, I see where this is going, or I see where this action is coming from. I remember, growing up in the Episcopal Church, it was the Latino congregation that I grew up in. We, Good Friday everyone was at church, and that service was very long, and so it really was, I think, a good way to really kind of loop back into the question around what are some good things, is to consider what you have and consider the community that you're serving. If you're a preacher, right, we don't want to limit ourselves to say this is only for people who are going to be preaching specifically to this, but also as lay leaders, like what are the actions or what are the things that we bring, the rituals that we incorporate into these services to make them really meaningful for people. And I think the one thing probably would say to kind of also not stay away from or try to shy away from is our realities today, right? Like, how do we incorporate some of that into our service and into our preaching or into the message of that day, if it's needed, and if it's not needed with words, maybe it's needed in other ways, right?
I was a professional singer, and I've come to really think about liturgy and the Book of Common Prayer specifically as almost like sheet music. It's not got all of it there. The music doesn't happen on the page. The music happens when you breathe life into it and occupy it with authority and authenticity. And speaking of preaching, regardless of whether what you do in your sermon, any leader of one of our liturgies is, I think, charged with making music and preaching through that service. Good Friday is one of them, but it's true all the time. We're always there to preach our good news through the forms that we have, which help us not feel so overwhelmed all the time to think that we have to make it all up, or it's all about us, or that it relies on us. It relies on God. It relies on our tradition that is such a beautiful gift to us. And we get to let it sing. When you get to, and that's why it's difficult in these formats without knowing, where the listener's coming from. It's so contextual. It's so much about you and your people. If you're connecting to your people, then it's gonna sing. And it doesn't have to look perfect, and the music doesn't have to be fancy, and it doesn't have to be Palestrina and all that stuff. It can sing with just the barest of bones, and sometimes it sings the best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to add one more piece liturgically, I couldn't agree with you both more. Absolutely. The other thing we need to remember is the setting that the service is happening in, and the setting of the Te Deum that it's happening in, right? From Thursday, Friday into Saturday, that is one service. It happens in different days at different times, but it really is thought of liturgically as one full service. And so, Luz, I love what you were saying about the invitational piece being so important, that if you're going to be invited into this, what are the entry points that people are able to come into this story so they can walk the whole thing? Mm-hmm. They can lament when it's time to lament. They can break bread when it's time to break bread. They're so pulled into it that they almost couldn't miss one of the days, right? Because they're so a part of the story. So I think you've all put that beautifully.
Let me shift us over to the gospel. And I guess my first question sort of is, how do we tell this story without being anti-Semitic? And I remember my Jewish friend explaining to me that Holy Week is the time that usually the most anti-Semitism occurs. And it's always people are usually fearful at that time, especially back a long time ago. But I think maybe it also is reoccurring now.
I'm happy to say that I'm very explicit about it in as a part of each Good Friday sermon, especially with the Gospel of John. There's a heightened sense here of the contextualization of a community, in John's case, having been pushed out perhaps, and then it coming out in contextual ways that the modern reader, first of all, likely doesn't understand, and then you have an entire history of Christianity piling anti-Semitism right into that text. So I start every sermon, whether it's going to be about that or not, with a disclaimer saying, hey, friends, one of the things we have to remember in this is the damage that can be done when we don't hold these holy texts in a way that's honoring all people. And I remind people of the mandate that we had just the night before on Maundy Thursday of loving one another. Sometimes that flows into the rest of the sermon. Sometimes it's a complete add-on, and I still think it's okay. I don't normally put little disclaimers at the front of my sermon, but on a day like this, I think it's almost impossible not to.
The way I approach that is the Jewish religion that we understand today has changed so much since 0 AD or whatever time mark you want to use. And to not be aware of that as Christians, as most of us are not, the many different cycles and processes and changes that religion has undergone, it can lead to believing that whatever happened and that Jesus was speaking against, Jesus is still directly speaking against those people. And that time has passed. So we should not be conflating the Jewish world that we know now with the Jewish world that Jesus was speaking against, and within, and complicating back then.
I think it's also, a part of, I know Hillary said it's not something that you start your sermon off, every sermon with this, but I think sometimes, I think I do. I sometimes try to give a little bit of background of hey, we're not going to always get it right. And and it's so, the way we interpret is so contextualized. We have to ask ourselves, I always tell people, you as a theologian, as a person, you yourself too, sitting on the pews, you are allowed to ask yourself some of these things. I always make the invitation of like, what was happening at the time, right? And so at that time, it was for a specific reason. I think it is also an invitation for folks to get involved and kind of know around, sometimes we say like, oh, general convention is not, it's not everyone's cup of tea. Like, why go for that? What matters is what we're doing on the ground. And I agree with that. I do believe that, the work that we're doing is in our parishes, and you start to educate and inform not only yourself, but your congregation. But I think there is also um, some hope in recognizing that as a church we've said, hey, you know what, like this is pretty hurtful and damaging, and this is not okay. And to be able to say, you know what, that's why general convention, there's a place where we can go with this, right? Like if we don't agree with this, so to say, there is a Good Friday liturgy that's approved for this, and kind of highlight and invite people into that conversation around the difficult ways in which we have to approach some of these texts, and definitely making sure, for me, I think one of the things is to remind myself for Good Friday is like, there has to be something that is said, especially if we're using the Gospel of John, to where, I mean, you're getting people from all over, right? And culturally, you really see the differences and of how hurtful this text can be. And I've seen, plays around just the way how we talk about our Jewish brothers and sisters around that time. And not even intentionally. Maybe, people were thinking, oh, it's just like a part of what they've always done, their tradition. But when you really stop and think and you ask yourself, like, that is very hurtful, and that is not, it's not okay for us to continue that, right? So at one point we have to say, hey, what worked back then is like Will, you were saying, it's not the same today. It has changed, and our actions, the way we speak about this text, the way we acknowledge this text has to reflect that too.
What I appreciated in your answer was how you brought in the Episcopal Church too, because there's an offering that's taken on Good Friday in many of our churches through the Episcopal Church that goes to the Christian churches in Jerusalem. But I've never really thought about it as a way of maybe even doing some instruction about the fact that we are linking ourselves with the Holy Land in this moment, right? And thinking about how the offering can take on a different shape because of that. And so this year I might highlight that. So thank you for mentioning that. I'd never made that link until this moment.
On whose shoulders does Jesus' death fall? And is that even important? Like, is it Judas? Is it Pilate? Is it the crowd? Is it Rome? Is it us because, we came, like, Jesus came for our sins?
We were looking at some of the readings for this day, and in the reading from Isaiah offers an answer to you that I think we need to potentially be at least aware of as preachers. Towards the end of that reading, it says, "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain." Especially, I think, in a social justice context, this idea that it was God that did this to Jesus is our most dangerous avenue that we have a chance for instruction. That God desired the hurt and pain of anyone or requires it of anyone is not the way I like to preach into the good news of Jesus. The fact that it happened is there, and we can continue to the discussion of who to blame, but I don't think blaming God is okay.
I think it's an interesting question. I also liked how you asked does it even matter? When I was a brand new priest, I once taught a adult discipleship class, and it was like, who killed Jesus? And it was supposed to be this kind of like, I was being really tongue in cheek, kind of like this murder mystery thing. And like, we went through all the different, I look back on it now, I'm like, that was probably a little too flip. But as I think about it now, and have continued to, I almost wonder, does it matter? Because would it not happen again and again? Does it not happen over and over again? When we see victims who are trying to preach peace or just trying to live their lives, and they don't fit somebody's model of what they want that to be, there are forms of crucifixion all around us. And so I think it's even more important to realize that if Jesus came today, something of this would have happened likely anyway, especially in the face of an empire that is as vicious in some ways as ever. So I think it's a timeless question, because it would have happened even now, I do believe.
I'm drawing here more on my musical experience than I thought I would, but J.S. Bach in the St. Matthew Passion, which is one of my most favorite and most amazing tellings of the Passion story, has, he's telling the literal story from the Gospel of Matthew, not the Gospel of John that we read on Good Friday, but and he recounts the Gospel literally saying, "Is it I, Lord? Who will betray me? Is it I? Is it I? All the disciples, is it I? Is it I?" And then Bach interrupts the text of the Gospel with a chorale that is not Gospel text, and where everyone sings in the whole congregation, "It is I. I did. I did this to you." And I mean, Bach, it's just amazing how theologically relevant he can be, even though the music isn't, to everyone's taste. But that powerful recognition that, like, who did this? Well, we're doing it, and I do it. Every day I fail to live up to the fullness of my Christian discipleship. And Good Friday is a chance to connect to the pain that I still experience, even if I try to cover it up in myself. So, who did it? It's like a historical, like you said, like a whodunit. Well, that's fun. But that kind of dodges the real deep connection point of why we're bothering to talk about this in our church spaces. It's not for historical consideration, really.
To that end, I once preached a sermon on Good Friday, playing with Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And it's actually, I think this story is God in the hands of angry sinners, right? And that's a timeless piece.
I love that you said that, Hillary. Timeless. It keeps coming back as we're listening to, even as Bach, or a musician has so much history, right? But like, it is something that is, if Jesus came today, we would be doing some very awful things. And so one of the things, whose fault or what, who did this, I don't think it's relevant, as in knowing that it is a part of me. There's parts of me that are good, but just like that, there are very ugly parts of me, right? That I don't always disclose, but knowing that those ugly parts also are damaging and are also hurtful. Therefore, I am still doing that to Jesus today. And yeah, so that really just makes a really important point, or brings it back. And I'm always looking at the characters that are present in Scripture, right? And thinking like, well, you know what? I probably would have been like, Simon Peter. And there have been days, or there are moments, or by the hour, these things shift, right? That's a whole part of existing, and that reminder of existing in a very broken world and a broken reality.
Luce, one of the things you just said that I think is so good to highlight, and it's a little bit adjacent from this question, but it's a preaching technique I think is very effective on Good Friday, is taking a character in the story, peeling that character out, doing a case study, letting the imagination go a little bit. What would it be like to be Peter? What would it have been like to be in the crowd? What would it have been like to be Mary? That is such an effective storytelling technique on a day like this. And so I was so glad you highlighted it, because I think that's something preachers should attend to.
This might not be the appropriate context for this, but maybe for Passion Sunday, but it'd be interesting to have people like read it and like take on the character, like almost like actors, and have them come up to the front and let the congregation ask them like, how do you feel right now? What are you thinking about this? And I just think that would be an interesting technique.
A plug right there for something I call bibliodrama. I don't know if you know about that, but if any of your listeners do, that's exactly what I would describe as what you're talking about. Taking a pause, hitting the pause button in a moment and saying, so Judas, you've just done this. What's going on with you? And then also in that technique, leaving room for other people to answer that question. So we have, thank you. We had one Judas here. Thank you. Is there another Judas who might have a different, what's going on with you? Like, what's another thing? Because it's not just one interpretation. This is another gift from our Jewish brothers and sisters that I'm so grateful for in the Midrash tradition, is we're not, and this is maybe also helpful and liberating for preachers on Good Friday who are trying to get it right, that this is less, I view preaching, this is less about trying to get to the right theology and the correct answer, and rather making room for a table of multiple valid interpretations. And the Midrashic tradition from the Jewish people that comes soon after Jesus' time opens up this amazing array of possibility in Scripture, instead of foreclosing it down to only one way that is correct. We all, I think, in our church would be wise to be able to spread a table where we gather to wonder about Scripture, instead of needing to all show up for the exact correct response that doesn't have the grace of Jesus and doesn't have the complexity of our human experience that we all get to bring and share together.
Well, I'm so glad you said that, because what you're suggesting here is a corrective to bad theology, especially that can sneak into atonement theory and days like this where we tend to think about sin and who's forgiven, who's not, right? Like a day like this is highly problematic for the chance for bad theology that can be traumatic for some to really enter in. And what you're suggesting is instead pulling the gospel from the community that's present, letting that be the theology of the day, instead of saying it has to be this way. If you don't get in line, you're going to hell. Good Friday's done.
I think because Good Friday is scary, I think out of anxiety, preachers might feel like they need to just lock it down so we're not all off the rails here, because there's a lot of heresies we could stumble into, and we don't want that. A bit of a digression. I feel like Good Friday is, of all days, this chance to just be able to hold all of the openness. I mean, like you said, in this Triduum time, the service isn't over. We might not even be needing to preach at all. I mean, of all days, this is a day where we should be able to hold the heaviness and the sadness and the grief. And in wondering about this time for myself, I just have become, very grateful that we don't move too quickly into Easter. I've heard that in some churches, Good Friday is very minimized, and we're always just trying to pound home that good news, Christian hope, Easter is coming. And that doesn't change. Of course that's true. It's more about the timing. How much are we willing to hold and sort of slow down our pace? And Good Friday is that chance of all of the times to slow it down. I was writing about this to someone, and I described it as, we don't want to binge watch our faith. Do you remember when we used to have to wait to watch the next, to find out what happens next? On Good Friday, we should have to wait. We should have to be stuck in the discomfort, stuck in the sadness. And I'm speaking from my own personal experience. Sometimes in deep grief, we just need to be in deep grief. And we get to open that up in our churches and share that collectively and model that for people in their lives and offer to them this very countercultural space where we're just all gonna be sad. And it's not gonna get fixed, and we can't make it stop, and it comes every year. And we don't need to rush.
I love that. Mm-hmm.
I think this is one of those few times when that can happen.
We are culturally here in the US, I would say, or most of us here, it's so easy to move on to the next thing, you know, and we're so used to everything is, you know, if I need to find a verse that I want to use, I can just Google it. If I want to, you know, find out what, like, order some food, I could just have it delivered. Everything, we're so that we're so used to everything coming and being so fast and accessible to us that sometimes, you know, we need to remain in those moments of hard spaces and feeling all of the things, and I think it allows us to, when we model that to our parishioners, to our in our congregations, I think that's the way to equip them to and prepare them for when they have to be in those moments too, and how we walk with them. You know, I've always, one of my favorite parts of seminary was doing CPE, you know, and being with people in their Fridays, you know, and remaining with them there, and not knowing what to do with that, right? Because we want to fix it, we want to, you know, make it right, and there was really nothing I could do or say to make this change for someone, right? And I think there is some beauty in being mindful and aware of how important it is to, in order to witness this love, we also have to experience the pain that comes with it.
What do we need to lay to rest, and or what has been laid to rest that we hope will be resurrected?
I think one of the things that I find very much in keeping with what everybody was just saying that is so refreshing to me about Good Friday and the parts of our tradition around the whole church calendar that call us to lament and to fast instead of just feast constantly is that it puts to rest the constant drumbeat of a culture that wants to sell us something, that wants us to be fearful all the time and so react to it, that doesn't want us to learn how to be equanimous and find peacefulness even in the midst of sorrow, that likes to pretend that we're all individuals, right? Like that sort of drumbeat that happens nonstop. When you come into church for Good Friday, nobody's selling you anything. Not even a Hallmark card of a false hope. You know what I mean? Like and that's good. Like there's a stark truth there that is, I think, powerfully countercultural, and it makes me think, thank God somebody's actually willing to tell the truth about all of life, not just the happy stuff, the hard truth, that there is nothing that I could buy, sell, promote, or, you know, grab onto power that's going to stop me from grieving at times, you know, and being in pain and lament. So what's laid to rest for me is just the falsehood of a culture that just is relentless with a different message.
I guess I'm really trying to think of letting, putting, you know, setting aside or laying down the expectations of a society that is constantly demanding something of us, and I, you know, and I think of how others are experiencing this Good Friday, how just our lived experiences are not the same, and the privilege that I have, and really remaining aware, um, and very, very, very just aware of that, and how that will create or push for something different, especially in a time of such division and I mean, and I think of such a time, but that this has been our reality for a while now, and how do we cope with that, and how do we remain faithful to our baptismal, our baptismal covenant of seeking and loving our neighbors, and just being very mindful of that.
I was thinking about like how much we allow. What I wish we would lay to rest is this idea that the church is the building, or the church is the thing that we do between 10 and 11 a.m. on Sunday, or it's the institution and its general convention, and how much we forgot the main piece, which is like the church is the relationships and the people and the work that you do with others. Anyway, and so I wish that bottom part maybe got resurrected a little more.
Mm-hmm. What's so right about what you're saying is that is the value of a fast, is it not? Like that we remember when we're fasting that we are not superheroes here. Like when you're in a fasting and your community has called you to fast, you remind you're placed first and foremost in remembrance of Christ's fast. Then you're reminded with those who are not able to eat every day. Then you're placed into remembering how finite you are as a person and how much we rely on one another and God. There's a stripping away of the falsehood of all the rest of it, the idols that we make. And we got to get really real when you're fasting.
I guess the question of what we lay aside, I'm not sure if this sounds right. I've never said it out loud, but I wonder if on Good Friday, for a moment, we allow ourselves to lay down our hope. If we say, we just don't know. We just got to the end of the road. And the story is people who got to the end of a road and looked at the results and were in despair. And the story will continue, but this is not, but many of the stories, when we live these stories, they don't feel like they're going to continue. And that is a very human, real moment where we lose hope. And even though, the mission of the church is all about advancing this great Christian hope, and so it feels, dangerous to say that we would give it up on this important day. But that it's this chance to sort of allow ourselves to be human, to be in despair, to not have to put on pieties or theologies, but just be laid bare with our limitations, laid bare having to look at the world that we made and recognize how much of a disaster some of it is, and to wonder, I don't know if I can do this. I don't think I can fix this, because that is the correct answer. But we can with God's help, and that will come later. So I'm curious how that struck all of you, the idea of laying down hope on Good Friday.
I really was thinking about, like, in Indian community, like, our leading cause of death between people ages like 12 and 30 is suicide, and how that's where they are at, right? They've lost hope. They've given up. They feel like there's nothing there. And I think it would be really interesting, at least for one of the communities I serve, to use that as a point in the preaching to talk about, like, here's what happened. They lost hope. They gave up. And I mean, you could connect that to the Judas story too if you wanted, but like, then think about, like, but what did they do when that happened? They got in community. They were with each other. They gathered together, and that's what we're called to do when we lose hope. So that way, maybe somebody who is feeling that way would then be able to connect with their loved ones and find community, because that's healing medicine.
Yeah, I also wanted to mention that it struck me that you could make a powerful sermon out of the first line of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Does Jesus give up some hope in that? It's I have a different thought about the Psalm that we can talk about later, but to your good question, like, that's one way that it's been read, right? Like, what does Jesus mean by taking that psalmist word? What did the psalmist mean? Do they not understand in that moment the deep bitterness of hopelessness, right?
Yeah, I think it is, Will, to answer your question, is it feels like a good practice for us, and I think it's important because yeah, that is what happened, and how do we live into that and speak of that too without it being criticized or frowned upon, right? Like, oh, here, this. So I could see why you would say, like, you would be hesitant to even share that aloud, but I think all of us have thought it, right, and have really
Hmm.
and know people or who have felt that, and how do we have those conversations if we can't name it, if we can't name the reality of, like, you know what, hope is lost.
That's a great question. I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to move us away from the Gospels. But how do we deny Jesus, or who do we deny?
We don't have nearly long enough to have this conversation. I've come close since seminary. Um, uh, I really came close to this idea of confession as a real blessing. I mean, it goes a little bit alongside of giving something up or giving up some hope of admitting something. Like, I'm not good enough. Um, Now, of course, people will be saying, "Yes, you're good enough," and it's like, "Yes, yes, I am. Yes, I am." But the ability to say, I'm not okay. I'm not all
Hmm.
that I could be. And that's not a guilt thing for me at all. It's a great relief. It's a liberty away from, for me as a white man, the burdens of superiorities that just got baked into me, whether I liked it or not. Um, to be able to admit that there is this calling of discipleship that calls me to something far greater than I can possibly attain, and yet with God's help I do, and somehow through grace I can. And confession for me is this great link into that possibility, into that grace.
Hmm.
Um, and I receive it not as guilt, not as pain or burden, but as the chance to just sort of be like really honest. Um, do I really think I'm like that great? Do I really think I'm got it all together? Like, no, name all these things. The ways I deny Jesus every day, I do it in all these micro gestures that I make of how I walk down the sidewalk, of who I decide to move aside for or not. The way I exercise my power in the world, which I do carelessly, even as much as I'd like to bring as much all the attention I could to it, I can't. I can't possibly. And so I try to recall and notice those moments as my personal devotion to admit them and ask for grace in them instead of ignoring them and pretending like they never happened.
Hmm.
Yeah, because when we do that, then we deny the shadow parts of ourself, and we become orphaned to our actual self. And then I think that radiates out. I think when we can only see ourselves as one good thing, any assault to that fragile little bubble of an ego at that point is
Hmm.
going to be met with almost a violent, no, you're wrong, you're wrong. And so that, I think, is then to make that circle wider. That's when we start denying others. That's when we start denying whole groups of people. That's when we just deny countries, right? And even deny our whole planet and how we are supposed to be walking gently on it. To me, this is a very dangerous form of theology that we see in Christian nationalism, where we have attached to a particular group of white people living in this country some sort of incorruptible perfectness, right? A manifest destiny, right? That is insane to think that you would get at, we would think this. And what ends up happening when you have this sort of mixture of white nationalism and prosperity gospel is that people can easily start to say, well, this planet is for our use. And by that they mean, white people who live in this country. It's for our use, and then once it's done, we're all going to be raptured, and it's going to be destroyed. So it doesn't matter, and that creeps in on Good Friday, right? With this idea of God getting ready to smite the world. You do hear it sometimes in the theology of the day. And so when we stop denying the truth, we can draw in the grace, and it's liberating. It adds to justice, and I think that's a piece that gets wrapped up in Good Friday all too often without being intentional about it.
With our current realities, we have to have some difficult conversations, right? Where we face our own fears, which I think is what causes us to really group people into otherness, right? And I've been really trying to think about it, especially just in recent weeks, months, maybe years at this point, where we've become so we believe a certain way that, kind of going with what you all are saying about how we don't really we're not really naming the elephant in the room, right? We don't want to say the thing because of how it will be received or how others perceive what you're thinking. But I think that we're gonna have to start naming those things, and because it is scary for those of us who are a part of those groups, it is scary to see the way people are now have felt empowered to say or share some of the things that they share out loud, which is very scary, and so I think that those of us with privilege and power and are going to have to really exercise that, so that our siblings in Christ who are experiencing just very public pain, so that we can really live into this moving from a Good Friday to Sunday, because if not, some of us will remain in this place of hopelessness for a while.
I think too, or what was coming to my mind was like, sometimes there's this overwhelmed. There's been so many like executive orders and all this stuff. They just get overwhelmed in all the mess of everything, and it's hard. And so I think as preachers, we need to like not be afraid of making people angry when we preach. I think so many of us, especially as rectors, we want to be liked, and so like we always want everybody to be comfortable. And I think it might be time to preach some of those difficult things, which is the whole reason we made this podcast, was so people can talk about social justice and connect it to the lectionary. Because I think sometimes if we don't steer everybody back on track with the message that needs to be there, then we're going to have this Christian nationalism and all these other heretical things that happen.
Especially when you remember that what's happening right now with all the swiftness of it all, shock and awe is a military tactic, right? And I think right now, if preachers have this opportunity to help people imagine what it would have been like under Roman occupation in a different way than perhaps many of us have before, right? Because shock and awe is a military tactic that an empire it's been used by empires for a long time, right? And so what is it like to live under the boot of empire? It's a worthwhile question then, it's a worthwhile question now, and in ways that if preachers don't seize this opportunity, then when will they, if not now?
Absolutely.
And I wanted to pick up on that, and Shaneequa, what you were saying about, this chance for bringing social justice into the floor. A lot of times when I've been in churches that are social justice focused, in quotes, the words that they use, a lot of times that can feel like they are applying the narratives of the world around them to the church service that they go to, and they are letting the narratives of the world around them drive those church services. And I get really angry about that, because we have a story in the church that is not beholden to anybody else's story. And we don't begin from the outside story. We begin from this story of our faith, and we go out. And so especially on a day like Good Friday, we should be in the story of our faith. That's where we are. And it goes out The social justice to wonder about as we situate ourselves, like Hillary was suggesting, in the Roman Empire, it is very notable that Jesus did not come to overthrow that government. Everyone wanted him to. Some people might be relating to that, but that's not what it was about. It was about, it's not that it wasn't about justice for all, but it wasn't about enacting policies of like greater social inclusion. It was about human beings enacting their interactions, imbuing their interactions with divine love that changes the way that we operate, that everybody gets to operate in the world. It is this deeply grassroots idea. And I think so often those social justice, quote, churches can try to abdicate their own individual responsibilities for that deep personal grassroots change to policies that they would like to see enacted, which are much more convenient for them if they would just happen. If we could just elect this person, well, then we wouldn't have to worry about anything anymore. It's like, that's not what our churches are about. Our churches are about us, that the power is in each of us, and that we get to go out into the world and radiate that power of Christ and the good news message to everyone we meet. And we don't need to worry if somebody has a different policy or, you know, what they're doing. Of course, we bring all of that love into the way that we vote and our governments, but we're not beholden to those powers. We have the power of God. And that is the message that sometimes I fear when we try to apply social justice into our churches and our gospels, especially on a very delicate and beautiful moment like Good Friday, that it would be a tragedy to try to slap on and tape on some social issue that would make the whole service about a thing and lose the deeply important message of connecting to our faith, the opportunity for confession, the opportunity for grief, the opportunity for loss, of despair, of hopelessness, that are so deeply human and will be taken into new life on Easter Sunday.
What parallels do you see between this passage and what's going on in our world right now? I was thinking about by a perversion of justice, he was taken away, and how so often our justice system is not equitable or fair or even moral sometimes.
Yes, I agree with all of that. And I also think there is the part about he's borne our infirmities, carried our diseases. There's a piece in all of this, especially situated where it is in Isaiah, in these lamenting pieces before we get to and with the suffering servant, for example. There's a piece that I think also we need to remember, that prophecy gives us also the view of hope and healing, right? In this message of how bad things are, it is still naming the fact that there is a God that is interested in knowing our infirmities and our diseases. And there's a God that is interested in being with the oppressed, not just interested, like that's God, you know, and in that, I hear healing in this verse because of how, I guess it's just similar to what we were saying before, of how honest it is, right? It's not trying to sugarcoat anything, and still describes a God who sees it, names it, and is with us in it.
Yeah, I think this really names all of the things, right? It names just the really dark parts of who we are and how we relate to what is, what Isaiah is saying and what we're reading here. And also realizing, I think naming that we have all, like all sheep, we've gone astray in one way or another, right? We're not, we want to, sometimes in our own ways want to reframe the fact that we have gone astray. We have left, and we have done those things that we could not think of ourselves ever doing, right? Of like, oh, how I would not. I mean, Peter was saying too, right? I would not deny you, Lord. And then here we are. I think there's I think there is some naming of this truth in our reality today as well, and just we are still carried, and all of these things are still happening in our world.
So what tips do you have for preaching Good Friday?
I'll mention one here. We've already talked about choosing a character, but it's not impossible to forget kind of the characters that aren't in the gospel. So for example, Psalm 22, dwelling on the idea of the psalmist and how the psalmist's words have been interpreted, actually can be drawn into the gospel because Jesus using them on the cross is so powerful. Especially when you remember Psalm 22 was kind of like the amazing grace of its day. Like when it was used in the temple, all you had to do was basically say the first line of it and everybody knows the rest of it, right? I say amazing grace, you know what to say next. And in fact that there's a character in the story by virtue of Jesus naming the psalmist that isn't even there that day, but has been passed down through the ages, right? Like, so what are the characters in this story that are being drawn in from the past that are going to be into the future, right? There's a anamnesis and epiclesis going on here. We're really trying to bring forth all of those who have gone before. So I just want to tell people, don't be stuck in just thinking that they are characters in the gospel. You know, what was going on with Isaiah? What was going on with the psalmist?
I think I always like to remind myself that my preaching cannot be the only thing that preaches. The words cannot be the only things that preach, right? So what is your congregation doing that lives into that, to where these to when you're preaching names these injustices, it doesn't feel like a shock, right? It feels like you are already walking and living into these realities, into this and it is a part of like what's ingrained in the work of your community and your congregation. Because I'm always, it's hard to hear a preacher, and though we want to share the good news, it is completely disconnected from the reality outside of our beautiful churches, right? And our the beautiful historical buildings that we have. But what the reality of what's outside there needs to be a part of it too.
Yeah, my tip, you said it well, Luz, that preaching first, I'd say, with the liturgy, and then with the sermon as you need. But don't forget that the whole thing is there and already given to us, and that we don't have to work too hard to make something of it. It's already all there for us.
And it's already been said, but it's worth saying again. Don't preach Easter yet, right? There's a reason we don't say Alleluia. There's a reason that we are tarrying here for a minute. And especially if you don't have a Holy Saturday service, that service often lends itself to a great pregnant pause. The space that we've been talking about that we sometimes give to Good Friday can also exist there. But if you don't have it, then Good Friday needs to do that work even more, like to have that space held so that there is a separation before we get to Easter.
Thank you all so much for being guests. I appreciate you sharing your wisdom and stories and thoughts, and I know our listeners do too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you want to learn more about Beloved Community, visit episcopalchurch.org/beloved-community. Thanks to our guests, Will, Luz, and Hillary. Thanks also to our production team, especially Michael and Asma. If you've been moved today, please rate, review, and of course, share our podcast. Until next time, let your light shine.
Do justice. Love mercy. These words echo through our tradition not just as an action, but as a way of life. At Episcopal Service Corps, we invite young adults to explore what a life of justice and mercy looks like for them. Whether that's on a farm in Michigan, in a classroom in Philadelphia, or at a nonprofit in the Wyoming Rockies. Our 7 programs across the country offer service opportunities ranging from 6 months to 2 years in length, with stipends and other benefits provided. Live, learn, and worship in a community of young adult peers while serving at justice-seeking churches and nonprofits. If you're looking for a place to grow in your faith and live out your values, consider ESC. Learn more today at episcopalservicecorps.org or on social media at Episcopal Service Corps.